for being a gracious God that has set up our relationship with you in such a way that we can look to our horizontal families here on earth and we can grow in our understanding of you. That as we look at marriage, we see a marriage that is to be reflecting a holy marriage that is set apart from all others as God sent his Son, who would be the pure groom, who would come to redeem his bride. And as we think of our children and the relationship there, you've given us a loving union with you that now sits us in the place of sons and daughters with the Father, and that we who are heirs can rightfully say that we are brothers and sisters with Jesus. And so, God, you've given us the roles of family to be a guide for us in understanding more and more of how we relate with you, how you relate with us. And so, God, I pray that we would keep that truth, that those truths would grow deeper, be caressed into our heart as we begin to think more and more about the ethos of our family. God, I pray this, God, in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, hey, so the way that this is going to be structured today, we are going to be a little bit of a timeline. So the last 6 minutes are going to eat a little bit into the last section, not the first two. This is the one session up front that isn't going to be quite as much Q&A. At the end, it's not going to be Q&A as opposed to the other sessions where there will be more time. This one's going to kind of require you guys to spend some time writing some things down, and you can continue writing things down in the first break. There will be a short break after each soul session, so you'll have a little opportunity for that. We need to go ahead and jump in. So I'm going to be starting off with a why, a family intro, family ethos, and a caution. And so as we navigate a lot of habits, if you listened to the sermon a couple weeks ago that I preached, the January 1st sermon, I kind of brought up some of the same things. I'll kind of reiterate a little bit today, some of the same things that are even in the notes. But part one, introduction to family ethos, the importance of habits in the life of the church. Why family ethos? Webster definition, the distinguishing character, sentiment, moral nature, or guiding beliefs of a person, a group, or an institution. And so when we think of ethos, we think of like the overall feel, the guiding beliefs that sets a culture, that is a distinguishing character. In other words, if other people were to look at your home, what would be the quick assumption? What would be that if someone spent a day with you without you knowing it, we'll say, because if you knew that they were there observing you, it would look probably different. But if someone were there, they were observing the culture of your home, what would be the normative thought? Like, what would be the normative thought that people would have as they evaluated the character of your home, the distinguishing points about your family? What would there be a common theme that came out if 5 people were able to observe your family, your ethos, the characteristics, the distinguishing things about your home? What would those things be? Every family has an ethos. The question isn't, how do you develop an ethos? The question is, what is your ethos, and what will it look like to see that ethos change if you would look at it and say, this is far from where it needs to be. But for everyone, like as I'm going over this and as Mary and I have been preparing to teach, we have a lot of conviction as well. So we don't come to you as those, neither does Bruce and Carol. We aren't coming to you as those who have arrived and we want to say, hey, imitate us. At least in all ways. By all means, there are hopefully some things that we've done really well over time, but at the end of the day, we are a fellow sojourner with you, growing and learning and feeling the need for correction, course correction, and looking at the overall culture of our home and recognizing it needs shaping. It needs shaping, and that's what I want us to process is where do we need shaping in our home and the overall character and culture and the moral nature. Like, what are the guiding beliefs? Because at the end of the day, one of the things that we also hold firm to is that everything that has become an identity in our home, everything that those 5 invisible people who are evaluating our home and say, well, I see this, I see this, I see this, those things have been formed because of a belief. And I think it's easy for us just to begin to think that we just do what we do, but you do what you do because of beliefs that shape that. Beliefs about God, or a lacking of beliefs, or a wrong understanding of God is what shapes the things that we do. I love one of the phrases that the author of the book, Habits of the Household, if you've not read this book, we are getting a lot of our ideas from this. By all means, this isn't just an all-encompassing, but we've talked about how this book will be a helpful book in this next season, as a lot of people have come with a recognition that there needs to be change in their marriage, change in their parenting, just I don't know what to do in this area of season of my parenting. And so this book, Habits of the Household by Justin Whitmell Early, this quote right here, moments aggregate and they become memories and tradition. Our routines become who we are, become the story and the culture of our family. So we're going to talk about the habits, the moments, and our family. Our families are all filled with routines, or one of the phrases I think is a helpful phrase is liturgies, the rhythms of life that we've got in place, that have been set in place already, have become our liturgies. The rhythms of life that shape who we become, the patterns, but are those patterns and liturgies the ones that we have chosen wisely? That's the question we want to process today. We want to process, are they wise liturgies? Have they been set forth with wisdom and godly understanding of what sets us up for living the flourishing life? And so when we think of creation and what shalom meant, it meant the flourishing life. So when we talk about the habits, there are habits that set us up for the flourishing life, and there are things that recoil. It's a phrase I think is a helpful phrase. They recoil against that in the same way of what happened in the garden. The sinful choices recoiled against the pattern of flourishing that God had set forth in the beginning. And the consequence, there were consequences immediately, and discipline and consequence, which we'll get to that later, immediately that came from the choices that set against the flourishing world that God had created us for. And so another quote, a liturgy in a formal sense is a pattern of worship that we repeat over and over, hoping that the pattern draws us into worship and forms us into the image of the one that we worship. So we all are being formed into the one that we worship. There's a really good book by G.K. Bill, and I recommend you read everything that G.K. Bill has read. I don't say that very often, but there's nothing that you could read from G.K. Bill that I would say is bad for you. And so read as much G.K. Bill as possible. But he writes about how we become what we worship. And so we are becoming what we prioritize, what we emphasize, what we adore, what we love, what we put our money to, what we put our conversations around. Like, all of these things are shaping us. They're forming us because it's what we worship. It's what we've got our heart set around already. There are already a multitude of things that we worship, that we turn to when we're angsty, when we're stressed, when we're feeling, as Tim Keller would say, the hell that we're living in. What is the thing that we turn to? Is it immediately Jesus always? No, for none of us do you immediately always think, I need to turn to Jesus. Sometimes we think, Netflix feels a whole lot easier right now, and I will feel immediately relieved by escaping into the world of Marvel or whatever that world might be that you feel like, if I could just see someone else's life that looks more disastrous for mine, it will make me feel better. But sometimes we turn to them as if they're our God, the thing that will solve our problems. And if we do it enough, we will actually believe it's the solution. Or at least we will live as if we believe it, right? And so a liturgy in a formal sense is a pattern of worship, the things that we turn to take us out of the hell that we are in. The beauty of changing our habits is that we are changing our knee-jerk reactions to ordinary situations. We uncover very different ways of letting God guide our hearts and our children's heart into patterns of life together. When we steward our habits of our family, we are stewarding our hearts. And that's what that's what we're going to be talking a lot about today, is how our habits are shaping our hearts. They are shaping our hearts. The question is, are they shaping our hearts in a good way, in a healthy way, in a helpful way, or are they not? Some of the things I want us to think of, cautions. One of the cautions that I talked about a couple of weeks ago is the caution of our hearts being shaped always in a good way just because we set good habits in place. And so you could do all of the right things and not necessarily have your heart shaped in the right way. If you have your life completely inundated with unhelpful habits, in other words, liturgies that are in place that recoil against the very thing that God has set forth in place for your flourishing, it's almost inevitable. I almost just take the word almost out. It is inevitable that your heart will grow cold towards God. But what I don't think, and what I want us to be cautious about, what isn't inevitable is that just simply putting really good habits in place will set your heart toward God. You see that with the Pharisees, right? Like you see that with the religious people of Jesus' day, that Jesus comes in, he had people who, they read the Bible, they memorized the first 5 books of the Bible, they prayed regularly, but they felt the need to let everyone know about their prayer. And one of the issues about setting forth really good habits, you could begin to compare yourself against others. Other people could begin to talk about how disastrous theirs are, and you could say, at least I'm not like you. Is that a helpful trajectory? No. So just simply doing the right thing does not set your heart in the right place. But if you're putting these things in appropriate order with a grace-centered or a gospel-centered focus, then by all means, the trajectory can set you forth by doing the right habits will cultivate and nurture and nourish that which is being planted. Grace is not opposed to effort. It is opposed to earning. Earning is an attitude. Effort is an action. Grace, does not just have to do with forgiveness of sins alone. Dallas Willard. And so as we think about grace, grace is not to be just simply something that we say, well, I've got the grace to get to heaven, I'm good to go, and live as if the things that we do, our effort, it doesn't matter. But we do want to put it in appropriate order, and the way that I talked about a couple weeks ago is we begin in union, our union with Christ, and now the overflow of what is certain and absolute in our union. Those who are in Christ will die in Christ. And we will live with him throughout all of eternity. But out of the overflow of union, this absolute certain thing that Jesus has done in us ought to be an overflow of communion and intimacy and closeness. If you look at this little graph here, there's union with Christ, apprentices in Jesus. Sovereignty establishes a absolute reality, and this is the theological understanding of what Jesus has done. But then the overflow is communion, and it's apprenticing with Jesus. It's a cooperative reality and spiritual practices, and it's growing in affection of Christ. It's desiring him. It's desiring Jesus. And then there's imitation. This next step that we take is imitation. In the same way that Paul was able to say, as I imitate Christ, so you imitate me. Imitation is good. We ought to look to Jesus and long to follow in his footsteps. David Mathis says, and just when we think we've been carried far enough that God has done for us all that we could imagine and more, grace shatters the mold again. Grace sanctifies. It is too wild to let us stay in love with unrighteousness, too free to leave us in slavery to sin, too untamed to let our lust go unconquered. Grace's power is too inhibited to not unleash for the unhappiness of true holiness. It's David Mathis. So we are to put ourselves in the path of God's grace. How do we put ourselves in the path of God's grace? This is what we long to do. Grace is the power. The gospel is the power. So how do we put ourselves and do our role in putting ourselves in the path to receive that grace? This is why David Mathis says in his book, Habits of Grace. So the only lacking, I would say, in this book is I think it could be read with kind of that caution that you could learn a lot of really practical. This is so practical. And I think the overflow is you hear how grace is exhibited in their home and in his counsel and his understanding of the everyday life of the Christian and how gospel change happens. But I would have loved for like that first chapter to just be on like grace and the gospel and its power. And one of the things I appreciate about Habits of Grace by David Mathis is the whole first chapter is on kind of that way of grace entering into everyday life. But he says, our God is lavish in his grace. He is free to liberally dispense his goodness without even the least bit of cooperation and preparation on our part. And often he does. But he also has regular channels. And this is what we're thinking about. What are the regular channels that God uses? And we can routinely avail ourselves to these paths of blessing, or we can neglect them to our detriment. What are the paths that God has availed to us? These paths of blessing. How can we grow in these paths of blessing or neglect them to our detriment? Bruce, you got next.
So, taking what Jason said kind of as the foundational point of where we're going this morning, I want to go to the other end. I want to look to the future. Because it's the vision of the future that motivates and drives the present habits and activities that we adopt, either intentionally or unintentionally. G.K. Chesterton says, the greatest political storm flutters only a fringe of humanity. But an ordinary man and an ordinary woman and their ordinary children literally alter the destiny of nations. Like as parents, as couples, you have the power and ability to affect the world. And so our desire is that you get comfortable thinking about that, creating a vision for your future. You want to start with the end in mind. Now, I've got a couple more up front. I just printed enough for each couple or each individual. So yeah, there's a couple more right there, David. So we'll get to this in a minute, but this is meant for you, if you're here with your spouse, for you to work together on, okay? So what I want to do is share a little bit, perhaps, of my experience in this endeavor to give you some ideas. So I used to think, as a father and a husband, that my role was to produce, I have 2 sons, produce sons who left home with my faith. And notice the pronoun my, right? And there were a couple events in my life around the same time that radically changed this vision. Most of you probably aren't old enough to have been there, but and I don't even remember what year it was, but it was the Silver Dome, Michigan, Pontiac, Michigan, Promise Keepers event. And Bruce Wilkinson gave a talk that rocked my world. It was called The 3 Chairs. And he talked about the generational slide of faith. And he gave several biblical examples. The one that stood out to me was Joshua, the elders of Israel, and the people in the time of the judges who did what was right in their own eyes. And Bruce said, first chair, you personally experience and see the works of God and personally involved in community with God. That's Joshua. The elders knew of the works of God. They knew of God. And then, of course, the time of the judges, they didn't even know God, right? So there's this slide. You see it in David and Solomon and subsequent kings after them, things like that. And Bruce said, our job is to move our kids to the first chair so that they actually leave home with their own vibrant faith. The second experience, because I raise boys, there's going to be a slight tilt to that side. And the books that I read at that time were manly books. The Barbarian Way by Erwin McManus. But Erwin gives an example in here of his involvement with his son that I want to share. So his son was at camp, and Erwin thought he would go up in the middle of the week and see how things are going. He got up there and he found out his son had had this big brouhaha with some other kid, and he wanted to go home. And Erwin felt that he should stay. So they went off into the woods to talk. And Erwin asked him, do you hear a voice telling you, inside you, telling you what you should do? His son paused and said, yes. What's that voice telling you? That I should stay and work things out. Can you identify that voice? And immediately his son said, yes, it's God. And Erwin wrote this: it was the moment I had waited for. I didn't expect it to come under those circumstances, and nevertheless it was there. I turned to Aaron and said, Aaron, do you realize what happened? You just heard the voice of the living God. He spoke to you from within your soul. Forget everything else that has just happened. God has spoken to you, and you were able to recognize him. And I'll never forget his response. Well, I'm still not going to do what he said. And so I explained to him that was his choice, but this is what would happen. If he rejected the voice of God and chose to disobey his guidance, his heart would become hardened and his ears would become dull. And if he continued on this path, there would be a day when he would never again hear the voice of God. There would come a day when he would deny that God even speaks or has ever spoken to him. But if he treasured God's voice and responded to him with obedience, then his heart would be softened, his ears would always be able to hear the whisper of God into his soul. So what you will hear over and over again this morning is it's about the heart. As Jason said, if you develop habits to control behavior, to control external factors, but it doesn't affect the heart, it's not going to impact you or your wife or husband or your kids. And so we'll talk over and over again about that. So finally, in just a little bit of time, and this is not meant to be exhaustive, it's meant to get you started so that when you go home, this will be an ongoing discussion as spouses. But the handout that David asked about, this is a tool. The idea is to think about what the future might look like. And this is just a grid that could help you project into the future and give you some concrete reality. So for example, if you have 3 kids in your home right now, 8, 5, and 3, and you start mapping out the years ahead, number one, it tells you how many more years you have with your kids. And it also shows you different stages of your family as your kids, maybe once they're all teenagers, or they're all before school, they're all under 5 or whatever, right? So there's different stages of life in your family that are going to require and involve different different things, right? So it's just a mapping kind of exercise to get you thinking about what's ahead for you. But the idea is that if your vision is for your kids to have a vibrant faith of their own, a communion with God and an imitation of God, as Jason was talking about, then you're going to parent differently now than if you're just trying to help them be successful when they get out into real life, right? So take 5 to 10 minutes and just start thinking about what you would like to see in the future when your children leave home, what you want to see them equipped with, how you want to see them relating to each other as family, to God. I don't want to limit that thinking too much, all right? So take some time and just start brainstorming, okay?